Hi, I'm Dylan.
Hi, I'm Faith.
Hi, I'm Martin. Hi, I'm Nathaniel.
Hi, I'm Neil, and this is Youth on Subjects of the World, and today we're here with Dr. Peter Gray. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, yeah, it's great to be here. I'm Peter Gray, as you just said. I taught for many, many years at Boston College in the psychology department. I've done research in a lot of different areas, ranging from neuroscience of maternal behavior in rats, how hormones act on rat brains to motivate maternal behavior, on through much more recently child development and education. And the reason I'm on here is because I've done quite a lot of research having to do with self-directed education. I've studied the graduates of the Sudbury Valley School many, many years ago. I've studied grown unschoolers to see what their life is like. I have interviewed anthropologists about how children learn in other parts of the world, and particularly in hunter-gatherer cultures where there's no such thing as school, but yet children become educated and for success in their culture through their own efforts. I write a blog for Psychology Today magazine called Freedom to Learn, which is about how people learn through their own efforts. And I've authored a book called Free to Learn, which is the thesis of which is that people come into this world really biologically prepared to educate themselves, that adults don't have to educate children, but rather the responsibility of adults is simply to provide the conditions in which people can educate themselves. So that's a brief introduction to me and my research.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think we're gonna. Well, I know I had a few questions because I wrote a few down. I think a big thing I want to know is like, what got you started in unschooling? Like, how'd you hear about it? And like, I mean, you seem to be pretty invested in it now.
Yes, well, I've gotten more and more intrigued by it all the time. But I first got into this realm of research when my own son, many, many years ago, was rebelling in public school. And he was rebelling in such a way that it finally became clear to his mother and me, even to the people at school, that we had to find something else for him. He was deliberately making a pain of himself at school from kindergarten through fourth grade. In a deliberate act of rebellion, he believed and would articulate, even as a young child, that school is prison, that he didn't deserve to be in that prison, that it was inhibiting his learning more than helping. He was very clear about that. And he was, as a way of, I think, ultimately getting out of it, he was deliberately rebelling in many ways. So he finally convinced us that we had to find something different. We weren't prepared to do any kind of homeschooling. We didn't even actually give that much serious thought. I think homeschooling wasn't nearly as common then as it was now. But I knew of the Sudbury Valley School, which was actually not too far from our home. It was just a couple miles away, within walking distance of my son. And he started there when he was 10 years old. And so here he was going to this school with quotation marks around it, which is nothing like typical school. There's no classes, not even offered, although kids who want to get together and form a class can do it. It just is whatever they make of it. And they can usually talk a staff member into taking part if they want. But mostly people are just doing exactly what you think they would be doing if they're doing what they want to do. They're playing, exploring, they're reading what they want to read, they're cooking in the kitchen, and so on and so forth. Yeah, go ahead.
What did you think of it when you first heard about it? Because I know for a lot of parents, it's a lot of skepticism.
It's very skeptical to start off, and a lot of parents are very apprehensive, and they have a lot of questions like, what do the kids do all day?
How do they learn?
How do they learn reading, writing, arithmetic? Are they get into a good college? Are they going to get a good job?
Right. Well, those are exactly the questions I had. Now, I wasn't negative about it. I actually had some a previous experience that led me to be open to this idea. It turns out I have a much younger brother, who's 12 years younger than me, who also rebelled at school. And my mother started a little free school in Vermont. I had already left home. I was in college and then in graduate school when all this happened. But I was aware of what was happening. And my brother has succeeded very well in life, despite having dropped out of school after fourth grade. He went back for a little bit in high school and then left again. So I had some background in that, but nevertheless, I was concerned. I think I was concerned about the kinds of questions that concern most parents. Would he be able to make a living? Would he, if he wanted to go to college? I don't feel like I was the kind of father who felt it was all that important to go to college, but it's true that in this culture, there's a lot of jobs that depend on college, the way we've got things set up right now. So could he go to college if he wanted to? Would he necessarily become an artist, And nothing wrong with being an artist, but it's hard to make a living that way, right? Unless you're very lucky and very talented. So those were my concerns. And that led me to do a study of the graduates of the school. So it was not a disinterested scientific study. I had a lot of personal interest invested in this. If the graduates of this school were not doing well, I wanted to know that so that I could play some role in finding something different for him if that were the case. Well, so I did the study. This was a long time ago. Already there were something like 90 graduates of the school, and I was able, with the help of a part-time staff member at the school, to contact almost all of them. And they filled out a questionnaire, and we interviewed some of them directly. And they were doing very well in life. Those who wanted to go to college didn't seem to have any particular difficulty getting in. They'd gone on, the graduates as a whole had gone on to the whole range of careers. So this had two effects on me. One is it led me to relax as a father. I didn't have to worry. It seems like he had at least as much a chance to go on in whatever he wanted to do going to Sudbury Valley as he would have if he stayed in public school. As it turns out, for him specifically, had a much more chance. Public school would have destroyed him. And the other thing is that it led me as a researcher to become fascinated. And so here, that study showed, somehow these people are becoming educated and they're not doing what looks like school. So how do they become educated? And that is what led me to do research on how children are learning, how young people, children and adolescents learn through play, the value of conversation, the nature of curiosity, all the things that eventually went into my book.
It's really fascinating.
Now,
I don't know, but Neil, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question.
Okay.
So I wanted to talk just really quick about a study that you did with Dr. Gina Riley, the one that involved 75 unschoolers that were adults now, and how they pursued higher education, and I guess, and proper layman's terms, how they turned out, right? So
Right.
I just want to talk about, so I think one of the most interesting things that I found is that, so for people that, haven't read it, the groups were 75 participants were split into three groups. Group number one had no schooling. Group number two had no schooling past sixth grade. And group number three, the last 2 years of, which would have been high school, they must have been unschooled. Is that correct?
Yeah, at least their last 2 years they had to have been, but they might have been unschooled for all of their high school years.
Yeah, it says that the median range for years of schooling was around 8 years for group three. So, but yeah, so what I found out really interesting is that working on pursue the likelihood to pursue a bachelor's degree, a bachelor's degree or higher was actually inversely correlated with the amount of schooling that the three groups received. I thought that was very interesting because, disregarding the fact that you don't need college to be successful, but just putting that, you think that because the standard school system and the standard ideology is that you go to school, then you go to college, then you get a job. And you'd think that, deviation from that standard ideology wouldn't have that as ingrained. And it isn't as ingrained normally.
Right.
You still see this correlation. It was a 29, I'm reading off this right now, 29% of group 3 went on to pursue bachelor's degree or higher, 44% of group 2, and 58% of group 1, which received no schooling. And when I was first reading the study, it was one of the things that I found the most surprising, because I expected them to be successful, but I didn't expect them to actually go out and pursue those high levels of education. I think that just shows that not necessarily that you will become, you must go to college, or you will go to college if you're unschooled or Sudbury schooled.
Right.
I think it's just saying that path is definitely open and definitely available. And it was also, how a lot of them were entrepreneurs, and what really surprised me is that it says 79% of the group that received no schooling pursued a career in creative arts, which I don't remember what that included, and then it said then 33% for the other two groups. So I mean that's an insane amount of people that went on.
Actually, 1 second.
Career.
I just to cut in. I'm gonna be right back. The house is really smoky, and I don't really know why.
Oh boy, you better check. Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
And if I'm not, I'm dead.
All right.
We'll see the flames on your screen. So yeah, I mean, I like that study just because of the fact that it gives, because a lot of parents, despite what you tell them, despite what you talk about, I mean, evidence is always best, I think, for, it's just, I think we had Gina Riley on this show, and I think she described it best. She said that it just shows, it's just saying, said the results of the study basically saying your children will be okay. It's okay.
I think that's the best. I think that's the best conclusion. They'll be okay, right? I mean, there's no, you're not taking some huge risk by doing this.
Yeah.
Now it's interesting. I'm interested in what theories you all might have. That finding that you described, where the ones that were always unschooled were the ones that were most likely to go on to a 4-year college program. Now, that could be a fluke. These were not high numbers. They're about 25 in each. It could have been just coincidence that happened. But it was a pretty big difference. And I'm wondering if you have any theories as to why that might be the case. If any of you, I'm asking this of anybody here.
I don't know. I found that so surprising. It's like, I mean, obviously there's the whole self-directed aspect, but I feel like you could also argue that since they're so self-directed, they wouldn't want to need to go. They don't think they would need to go to college to pursue something.
Yeah, you might. Yeah, that's what would lead you to predict that fewer of them would.
I think.
Anybody have a thought as to why it didn't come out?
I think the freedom of choice there plays a really big contribution to that decision, because that could show that that percentage of people wanted to pursue jobs that more typically needed a college education to get a job, like doctors or lawyers or stuff like that. Like, it's just, I find it thought-provoking, because if you put a child in an environment where they're free to learn on their own, they will humans naturally are curious and want to know things. So if you put in a child in an environment where they have the freedom to choose what they want to learn, and then they get to an age where they can choose to go to a place to learn more, I think it's definitely I don't think it's super surprising to me that there would be a good amount of people that would make that decision.
I think it was really interesting too. I was listening to a great podcast. It's Radio Lab. It's pretty popular, but
Yeah.
They were talking a lot about, I forget the exact name of the study, but it was the one where it was the participants who had to like shock someone in another room and all they heard was their voice. I'm sure it's a very famous like
Yeah,
study.
the so-called Milgram
Yeah,
experiment. Stanley
exactly.
Milgram did that.
And it was really fascinating that like, I mean, people really were pretty relentless. But as soon, like he had a script, Dr. Milgram had a script that he would say to people when they started to want to stop. He'd be like, if you stop, we're going to have to stop the experiment. And then, and they kept doing it. And, but as soon as he told them direct orders, like you must do it, they stopped instantly. People, if you said it, if you didn't give them direct orders, like you must, or you should proceed or otherwise we'll have to stop or you're ruining the experiment. But as soon as he said, you must proceed, every single person stopped instantly.
It's the classic forbidden fruit effect. It's the classic. It's in everyone, really. You tell someone not to do something and they're going to do it. And this is so much more prevalent than in any other group than in children because they're learning and they're doing this. And you can do an anecdote very easily. Tell a 3-year-old not to pick something up. They're going to pick that thing up the second you say it. I mean, reverse psychology works very well on children because they literally, the whole forbidden fruit thing. So I think when you give them, the freedom of choice completely, I guess they may objectively, see where they want to go. And instead of it being shoved down your throat, and I'm not saying group 3 had anything, shoved down their throat. It's just that, the average years of schooling were 8, median. And, maybe that 8 years of schooling, they were like, my God, I don't want to go back to the system again. Or this has been shoved in my throat my entire life. I don't want to do this. Whereas the unschoolers, the completely unschooled group may think, maybe I, do want to pursue this. And, I don't have a bad experience with it yet because this is the group with 0 years of schooling. And, I guess maybe I, should do this.
I would want to be curious. I'd want to be curious what percentage of free schoolers who have been to public school want to go back versus the percentage of unschoolers who have never been to a public school environment.
I think you're getting at sort of what my theory about it is, which is, who knows if this is right, but my theory about that finding is this, that the students who started off with unschooled all the way, they had never experienced formal education. They didn't have any reason to feel bad about it. They were not selected as people who were rebellious about public schooling. They were just people whose parents decided this is the way I want my child to become educated. All the others, in some way, got themselves into unschooling, right? They're ones who, in some way, started off in public school or in formal homeschooling. And somehow there was an evolution towards unschooling over time, probably resulting at least in part from the fact they really didn't like public schooling. They didn't adapt well to homeschooling, to formalized homeschooling. So there was a kind of selection factor from them. These were people who, in that group, those groups, who really did not like formal schooling. So in that sense, it's maybe, if you think of it that way, it's not surprising that a larger percentage of them did not go on, at least for a 4-year degree. Most of them did go on for some kind of further education, however. They went on for training in some area that was useful for their employment. So that's kind of my theory about it.
And Peter, I have another question that's fascinating me a little bit, and I'm kind of asking for my mom and like if we get questions, because me and Neil, we go to a lot of our open houses and we have to answer a lot of questions. So I have two that are very similar. So for my mom, she's a big writer. Like she went to college and she minored in English, and like she likes to write a lot, and she's a pretty good writer. And she's always feared for me because she's always like public education, got a master's in college, like very regular schooling, and she's always nervous with that we won't like have correct grammar. And I know a lot of or just not just grammar in general, but just being able to be good writers. And I know
Right.
she fears for us that we'll never be able to be good writers. But I mean, my always argument is like writing has always been important to her because she's always been good at it.
Right.
But another question I think is close is we get a lot of questions about video games, kids that play too many, like not too many video games is the wrong word, but parents that are afraid that all their kids are going to do all day is play video games. And it's hard to have a good answer. And that's nothing my mom really cares about because me and my brothers aren't big video
You
game
get that a lot,
players.
and I feel like it's a little hypocritical because if someone hears the kid is reading books all day, then people are going to be like, oh, good for little Johnny. He's reading a book every day. And it's like, well, yeah, but books are just a form of media, just as movies are a form of media, just as YouTube is a form of media, just as video games are a form of media. So it's like, I mean.
So I'm curious what your
Yeah.
input on that is.
Yeah, so, well, let me take the writing first, since
Mhm.
that's the one you asked first. It's interesting, when that category of creative activity included writing and even not fiction, of course, but even nonfiction writing, if you were a journalist or something, we put into that category of creativity. I believe we did. It's not uncommon for people who are products of self-directed education to go on as writers, and especially not uncommon for them to go on as creative writers. I think that the way you become a good writer is one of the ways you become a good writer is by reading a lot. And in fact, one of one of the things that has come out of my research is that people in self-directed education do tend to read a lot. I think they read a lot more than kids in public school, and they read in a more intense way. I mean, if you're in public school, reading is a job. You're made to read. You're forced to read.
Mm-hmm.
And so you read, but you don't. But on your own free time, you're less likely to read because reading has been made to appear to become a negative thing in your mind. It's something you were forced to do. You had to learn to read at a time that you may or may not have wanted to learn to read, may or may not have had a reason to learn. You're forced to read books that you have zero interest in. And so you're less likely to spend time reading and discovering what you really enjoy reading. So the more you read, the bigger vocabulary you're going to develop, and the more you're going to have a sense of sentence flow and so forth. One of the best ways to become a good writer is to do a lot of reading.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of it. The other thing, I mean, this is an observation that I made. I haven't taught in the university for a number of years. I'm retired from teaching. But I noticed that over the years that I was teaching spanned the time that the home computer revolution occurred and people began to use email at least. Facebook wasn't a big thing then, and nor was texting, but people were already doing a lot of communication with the written word over the computer.
Mm-hmm.
My observation was that writing was getting better among college students as that occurred. And the reason, I think, is because people were now beginning to grow up using the written word as a mode of communication. Now, maybe their spelling wasn't great. Maybe their grammar wasn't great. But they were communicating ideas in writing in clearer ways than the students had before, in my judgment. So I think that one thing that's happened, and I think it's an even bigger thing now with texting and everything, the result is that we have gotten so that we communicate in writing. Kids are growing up communicating in writing almost like they're communicating orally.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that the writing was so bad before is writing came across as artificial. This is something they're trained to do in school. They're taught there's certain rules about writing. So their minds would tend to freeze up about writing.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the students were much worse at conveying an idea in writing than they would have been just speaking to me, right? And now they were communicating as well in writing as they would in speaking. So that's the big problem in writing. Grammar, punctuation, that's pretty easy. You can solve that. You do a little study of how to do that. You could always edit and so on. The big problem in writing is how do I convey the message, the idea that I want to get across. So in that sense, I really believe that self-directed education is better preparation for good writing than school is, because you are not learning some artificial way to do it.
Yeah, it's a more natural way of learning how to write.
I definitely want to comment on that. It
Exactly.
seems like so the way I've seen, I guess I'll use the broad term of free schoolers, unschooling, temporary schooling, all of that. The way they learn, what people like to call the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic.
Right.
They seem to learn it more of in school. You learn it by sitting down and learn this. And it's, why am I learning A? Well, because you need to learn A. Why? Well, because you need to learn A. And it's a circular logic thing. It's like, okay, I'll just sit down and shut off my brain, turn off any critical thinking, just do this. But however, when it comes to, self-directed learning, you see a lot of where you see it as a means to an end rather than just doing it for the sake of doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, the way I learned to read and write was I found myself at like age 6 interested in reading books, because books are a form of media that I've always been fascinated in. And comic books in particular to me were very fascinating. So I learned to read because I wanted to read comic books. And the way I figured that out was I would read comic books until I could actually read. And then I wanted to learn how to write because I wanted to see if I could write my own comic books. And that's how I learned how to write, because I liked comic books at the age of 6 and I wanted to write and read comic books. Right. And I think something that happens when you force, like, something that I always find interesting is I have a lot of people that like I communicate with via text message or email or just like over the internet. And the difference between the way people who are homeschooled type and the way people who are forced to go to school type is astounding. Like, most of my communication with people who are homeschooled or unschooled or like just self-directed learning, typically I see a lot more understandable grammar, and like just the message is conveyed better and it seems like it would come out as a sentence. And when I talk to someone who is public school, it'll be just as fast as you can type it out, like shortening the word you to just the letter U and stuff like things like that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But when you're reading it, it's a lot easier to digest the information if it's written the way it's supposed to be written. And I think it's interesting that people who are homeschooled, at least in my experience, are more likely to type in the way that like is easiest to understand compared to people who are forced to go to school where they type the way that's easiest to type.
I feel like
that's interesting. I think that Faith, are you making a point there?
I definitely noticed that too, and kind of how I learned to read. We had like a deaf friend who would come over to our house when I was younger, and like we had to put captions on TV for her to be able to like read it. And we just kind of left them on, and I started like just watching things and always just found myself reading the captions to understand words. And like now I'm like a speed reader because of it, just reading those captions so quickly.
I think it's fascinating. Like at our free school, we're very into watching a lot of anime. And I don't know if you know, Peter, but a lot of the times, like when they do an anime and they have to do it in English, the voices are really bad.
Voice acting is absolute trash a lot of the time.
It's really bad. So
actors.
We like to do it just with subtitles. So you have to read the subtitles. And my brother, who's I think he's 11, he's gotten really good at like reading because he has to read the subtitles really fast. And it's interesting because there's another kid who really wants to watch, but we refuse to watch in English. So if he wants to watch it, he has to read, which is kind of weird.
Yeah. I think what you're getting at in everything that all of you are saying is there's the fundamental difference between how you learn in self-directed education and how you learn in school. Is that when you're learning in self-directed education, you're learning for a reason that you have in your own mind. You want to do something. You're learning to read because you want to read something. You're learning to write because you want to write something. You want to communicate something. You're learning calculations because you want to calculate something, whether it's a baseball average or whatever, or cutting recipes in half or whatever it is. You have a reason for doing it. So you do it, you learn it in a genuine way related to what the purpose of this is. What's the purpose of reading? What's the purpose of math? What's the purpose of writing? Whereas kids who are learning it in school, they're learning it just because they're told now it's time to learn this.
I think it's I think it's really fascinating when I talk to parents that are skeptical,
Yeah.
or just people that are skeptical. When I tell them the story about like my friend who has to read the subtitles, it's almost like, well, that's an unnatural way of learning. Like that would never work, even though it's working.
That's the most natural way of learning.
Even though it's
Yeah.
working, it's like that. Well, that's not how you're supposed to learn, which is so
I think
stupid.
that's the biggest problem with it is because the stigma and just the way that we naturally think of learning now is completely shifted than what the actual meaning of the word is. Like,
Right.
and I think that is a very big problem. I just wanted to show that this is this is the book that I first read.
Batman.
And
Okay.
it's an encyclopedia.
Batman something. The Dark Knight.
But
It's
Peter,
an encyclopedia of Batman comics, and it's pretty big. And I read this whole thing front to back when I was 7 years old because I was interested in what it was. But actually, Nathaniel has been trying to say something.
Oh, yeah.
He hasn't gotten a chance to.
The only person who goes to public school, I agree with everything you guys are saying. Like I love history. I'm a history buff, and
Yeah.
I've learned more on my own, like watching YouTube videos, reading history
Right.
encyclopedias, than I have ever learned in school. Like I've
Right.
learned a lot more topics that many of my peers don't even know exist, just on my own.
Right.
Like, and,
Yeah.
like I agree with everything you guys.
Yeah,
are saying.
thanks for that
I don't
contribution.
think school like catches up as well as like they feel like some of the stuff that they teach. It's like some of these things have been like disproven, like
Yeah.
especially when coming like to history and things like that. And like the story of Columbus. Now that's a very complex story because he wasn't exactly because some people get the standard school thing. He discovered America and blah blah blah. Then there's the side where it's like he was a genocidal maniac. But it's actually somewhere in the middle. I just recently learned by watching this like 30 minute long video called In Defense of Columbus. And it was a very interesting video.
Uh-huh.
But so
actually, Neil, I wanted to, Peter, I don't know, can you elaborate on like the video games question?
Yeah, let me go back to that.
Yeah.
So actually, video games is something I've done a lot of writing about. If you look at my Psychology Today blog and look at the table of contents there, you'll find that I've written 5 different blog posts on video games. And the reason I have looked into the research on video game play is because I do a lot of speaking to many different groups, not just unschoolers groups and so on, but to public schools, to many parents groups about the value of play. And one of the first questions I was always asked by parents is, well, what about video games? And the assumption that they seemed to have was that video games are bad and we need to limit screen time in general, as if screen time is all the same kind of thing. And even as if video games are all the same kind of thing. So I didn't exactly know how to respond to the question. I'm not a video gamer myself, although my son has always been a big video gamer, and I know people who are and so on, but I've never been into it myself. So I couldn't speak from direct experience, nor had I done any research on it. So what I did is I examined systematically the research that has been done. It turns out there's a lot of research done on the question of are there any beneficial or harmful effects of playing video games a lot? And there are all these, what I have now come to call myths out there about the negative effects of video games. And I could run through these myths. I sort of, collected what they are by looking at what people are saying and writing about video games who believe they're harmful. One of the myths is that playing violent video games causes real-world violence, that somehow if you are playing these violent video games, you're going to go out and act that way in the real world. There's zero evidence for that. There are studies that purport to show that playing violent video games increases violence. But when you look at those studies,
It's like correlation.
in no case is it real violence. Every case, it is some kind of laboratory simulation of violence, and it's always a short-term effect. And it is by no stretch of the imagination is this real world violence. Moreover, there's a lot of explanations for why you would get that effect. The best studies that have been done where looking at real world violence show not only no evidence of cause effect, but not even a correlation. In other words, there's not even any evidence that people who play that people who are more violent in the real world are more likely to play violent video games than anybody else, or vice versa. So the best study that I know of was one done with a large number of boys and young men who lived actually in a high crime area and were of a population where there's fairly high violence. And they looked at how much violent video games these boys and young men were engaged in. Actually, they were all boys at the beginning, all teenagers at the beginning of the experiment, of the study. And then they looked at real world violence. They actually collected court records. And the result was no correlation at all. The people who were playing lots of violent video games were no more likely than anybody else to have been accused of a crime, of a violent crime. Not surprisingly, people who for whom there was violence in their home were much more likely to commit a crime. So exposure to real world violence in your real life increases your likelihood of being violent. But pretend violence on video games does not. I've just been absolutely convinced of that. You know, there have been a long history of trying to prove that children's play with violence somehow predisposes them to violence or inures them to. I mean, when I was a kid, this was in the 1950s, we all played cops and robbers. We shot one another with cap guns. You know, we engaged in this so-called violent play. I murdered lots of cops as a kid. Right, but I didn't go up to be a cop killer, right? Nor did my friends, as far as I know. So so that's number one. Number two, there's a belief that you read various things about how playing video games kind of rots the mind. It's this dumb kind of thing you're doing, and so that nothing could be farther from the truth than that. It turns out that, and there's actually a lot of research, and I could refer you to review studies that make this point. There's actually nothing that has ever been discovered, no kind of activity that's ever been discovered that builds intelligence better than video games do.
Really?
That's true.
Well, I'd love to see those studies.
Well, take a look in my blog post on Psychology Today.
For sure.
For a post called The Cognitive Benefits of Video Games. Don't take my word for it there, but I give many references there to the studies. And you'll, among other things, see a review article in the American Journal of Play that is written by three very prominent researchers who compiled these data. So one of the first findings relative to this is that kids who play a lot of video games have higher IQs than kids who don't. So that's a correlation. There's two possible.
I was going to say that's a correlative. That is a correlative.
There's two possible explanations for that. Maybe it's just that smart kids are more likely to play video games than kids who have lower IQs. And the other possibility, though, is that playing video games actually increases your IQ. So then they actually did experiments. They took people who don't play video games, and as part of the experiment, half of them were assigned to play a certain video game, that different experiments use different games over a course of, a certain number of hours a week for a certain number of weeks. And they measured various kinds of cognitive abilities of the same kind that are measured on IQ tests, things like ability to make quick and accurate judgments, ability to hold a lot of information in your mind at once, ability to pay attention to what and figure out what's important versus what's not important, and so on. And it turns out that, lo and behold, the group that plays video games becomes better at those things than they were before. The group doing the control thing does not become better. And this is a lasting effect. Even if they don't continue to play video games, that improved ability stays on.
I know. I've been taking driving lessons recently, and I took my first one yesterday. And the guy who was doing the driving lesson, he was saying that people who play video games tend to be significantly better drivers.
There's research showing that new surgeons who play video games are better surgeons. Not surprisingly, new airplane pilots who play video games are better pilots, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of careers for which the kind of skill that is developed in video games. There are also many studies that suggest that people my age ought to be playing video games. There's evidence that it protects against the degenerative effects of old age on mental capacity. We tend to lose memory. We tend to lose some of our ability to make quick judgments, to think quickly, and so on and so forth as we get older. And there's research showing that playing video games tends to reverse those effects in older people.
Yes. Something that I think something that's interesting is the stigma around video games. I think a lot of the issues that people claim to see in children is a direct result of our school system and our parenting rather than a result of video games. And I think something that has happened pretty historically, just in everything from large-scale situations to little arguments in like families or friend groups, is people don't tend to like to think about what they've done to affect situations they see, and they tend to look for reasons that are out of their control to focus on, because it's much easier to find something that isn't something as a scapegoat. To find something that isn't something that you created or are a part of, to blame.
So let me give you an example of that. So one claim for which there is some truth is there are a fair number of very depressed people who play a lot of video games. And the assumption that is often made is that playing video games has made them depressed. They're depressed because of that. But an alternative hypothesis, which actually in the interviews seems to bear out, and it fits with, I actually have a friend who does therapy with video game players who believe they're playing too much, and they come to him for help. His belief, and there's actually some research evidence supporting this, is it's more likely the other way around. That if you're depressed, you play video games because it's almost the only thing you can do that helps relieve your depression. If you're depressed, you don't feel like going outdoors and meeting friends. You don't get involved in other kinds of things. But video games are easier for you to become involved in, and also it may take your mind away from some of the things that are depressing you. So the fact that there is that correlation does not necessarily mean that video play is causing the depression. In fact, I don't know of any evidence indicating a causal relationship between playing video games and depression.
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating. I was listening to a great documentary made by Vice News, and they were talking about video game addiction in Korea. Yeah. And my brother, he loves to play this game. My little brother, he loves to play this game called League of Legends, which is an incredibly popular video game. And like Korea, like most video games, are much better than everyone else, with not really close second. And like Korea has one of the highest video game addiction problems. And part of the documentary, they went to a video game addiction specialist, and he was talking about how the difference between the brains of a professional like League of Legends player and someone that's addicted to it. And the person who's addicted to it is using it to sustain themselves, and the person who's a professional is trying to attain a goal. So by playing whatever 12 hours a day, they're not doing it because they need to. They're doing it because they want to become the best. And
Right.
I thought that was really fascinating. And also Korea,
Mm.
their school system is really crazy. And I think they have
Right.
one of the highest suicide rates in the world, like a very depressed culture. So,
I think, yeah, I think you've made a good point, and I think that there are people who play a lot more video games, play video games more than they otherwise would, and they're doing it because they don't have other routes for meaningful activity. The other routes are being closed off to them. So let me give you an example. This is something I often get into discussions with parents about. So a parent will say to me, I want my child to play outdoors, and my child doesn't play outdoors. He just plays on video games. And so I'll say to the parent, well, what options does your child have for playing outdoors? Are there other kids to play with outdoors? Is your child free to get away from adults outdoors and play? And oftentimes the answer is no. And so, of course, people don't want to just go outdoors just for the sake of being outdoors. They want to go outdoors to play and be involved and do interesting things and have adventures. And you can't do that if there's some adult following you around and telling you what to do. When I was a kid and throughout most of the world, throughout most time, children, even as young as 5 years old, were free to just go outdoors and play, and there'd always be other kids outdoors, and you could get into adventures. You could have real world adventures, and you could make things, and you could get lost and find your way home, and you could get in trouble and get your way out of trouble. I mean, life was exciting outdoors. That's no longer true because we're so risk aversive with our kids, so overprotective that we don't allow kids to have real adventures in the real world. Well, then why should we be surprised that they go to the computer for adventures?
yeah, it's
Exactly.
like little
I-
Billy,
you know,
little Billy, get off the computer and stop playing video games. But don't go outside and
Right.
don't just sit on the couch. You got to
Yeah,
do something, but you can't do anything.
Something,
Right.
do anything.
think
But I
also,
think that leads like perfectly into like, what were you saying?
just real quick, I think another issue is people, like, something that I've had discussions with my parents about it. Like, my mom's like, oh, I would love to I have a lot of younger siblings.
right.
Like, I have no problem myself with letting like my children play outside, is what she would say. But something that tends to happen quite often is other people see children outside on their own and like have an issue with that. And there was actually a case in my area in the last few years where that happened to someone in the area, where they got the cops called on them because their kids were outside and they weren't outside.
I actually saw this exact thing happen. So there's this little boy in our neighborhood that then he was, just over, he likes to ride his, tricycle or whatever.
His name was Neil Karkanis.
And but he just really, so he was just, over, his parents were actually, because he'd go out on the tricycle and he just come over to, it was small neighborhood, so he'd just come over to our house. And he was over there, and then so we were walking outside and he was there, and he got back on his tricycle, and so my dad was like talking to like my sister or something. We turned around and he was, going down the road. So we turned around, go get him. And but the thing is first of all, let me just say, I mean, there weren't really any dangers on the road. It was just a road, and he was just going down, and it's a neighborhood road. It is a residential road. In fact, it's not even one of those residential roads where you can drive. It's a dead end road. So there's no point in going through there unless you're like mail, unless you're delivering mail or you're doing something else or whatever. He was going down there. So yeah, my dad went to go get him, and his parents came in and they were talking, and and this parents thing that always happens. He just comes over to our house. He's great kid. But the point is, they got child protective services called on them. Like, the kid just can't be wandering around and stuff. It's like, it's a kid. It's like, are you kidding me? And it's just ridiculous. And my dad had to go over there and try to end up. And it was because the real reason was something so petty, like a homeowners association meeting was happening or whatever, and one of the members of the family didn't agree with it, and and then that happened. This has been going on, the whole kid going around but you cannot take it out. It's like there's so much this culture of like helicopter parents over their kids, and it leads perfectly into one of my biggest pet peeves is what I like to call just unnecessary. Just stopping kids. It's not a coined saying. I don't know what I like to call it, but it's just parents just stopping kids from doing things just unnecessarily. I'll give an example. I was at the dentist in the waiting room, and there was a kid there, and he was just sitting there. They had like little toys because it was like dentist for kids. It was what is it called?
Orthodontist? I don't know.
That's an orthodontist for braces.
Oh, right.
Whatever. But so pediatric dentist, I think. I don't know. But so the kid was like playing with this toy, very quietly sitting in his chair, playing with the toy, and the mom was like, okay, now put it back. It's like, what the hell? Why does that matter? The kid, I was seething sitting in my chair. It's like, because this mom sitting there on her phone, it's like, okay, put that back now. Why? And then the kid tries to like move a chair, one of like the little toy chairs over to sit down on. She's like, put that back. It's like, why can't the kid just occupy himself?
Yeah.
He wants to just sit there and you're texting your friends on your phone and he can't do that. Like, it's just ridiculous. You can't just sit there and play with a toy. I mean, this is like a 6-year-old kid. And
other than that, you have no strong feelings about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I might suggest is, there's actually an organization which I'm part of, along with Lenore Skenazy. Lenore Skenazy wrote the book Free Range Kids, which documents the changes that we're talking about. And she and I are founding board members of an organization called Let Grow, in which are trying to change this culture. But what's happened over the years, there's been a gradual change ever since it's really started way back in the 1950s, gradual change of increased belief that the world is dangerous out there, even though the reality is it's not any more dangerous than it was before. And it's less dangerous now than it was, statistically less dangerous than was true. So, and even people can legitimately fear traffic, but even in areas where traffic is no concern, parents don't let their kids out. The biggest fear that parents have, believe it or not, is that their child is going to be snatched away by some stranger danger. And the truth of the matter is, this almost doesn't happen. It almost doesn't happen. It does happen, and when it does happen, it gets, everybody hears about it. But it's a very, very rare. In fact, I just read an article that said that in Canada, think of how big Canada is, over the last 2 years, this has happened once. One time. In the United States, it would be somewhat more because the population is a little bit bigger. Somebody figured out that there's less than one chance in 14 million that your child will be snatched away if your child is out there unaccompanied by an adult, no matter how old the child. So so we have this unrealistic fear. I mean, the chance of this happening is less than the chance of being hit by lightning. So so we have this unrealistic fear, and that fear has pervaded the culture. And what has now happened is it has become a moral issue. So if you as a parent allow your child to go outdoors to do something like walk to school or go to the store or, go play in the park without an adult, and your child, even many people, this is true even for their teenage children, but if your child is, say, 8, 9, 10 years old, this is regarded now as negligent parenting. Everybody sees it as negligent parenting. Whereas it was completely normal parenting in the past. This was the life of children. They were out there playing and exploring on their own, figuring things out. We have gotten so that we completely underestimate children's abilities to look out for themselves, their abilities to be cautious enough to take care of themselves, and their abilities to deal with problems as they arise. And the result of that is that children aren't learning how to do those. And that's one of the reasons why the rates of mental illness among people is skyrocketing, among especially young especially teenagers and young adults, because they're not acquiring the kinds of abilities that you learn by having this sort of independence. They're always being looked out for by some adult.
Yeah, I've always been lucky to have like parents that really don't care, and I've never really used the term free range kids. It's just like life.
Right.
You've
Sure.
just always been outside, and
Right.
it's really fascinating, especially this summer more than others, is like how a lot of our friends from the Sudbury School, we live pretty close to each other, and some days, like, well, it'll be very spontaneous that we'll just walk over to our friend Jeremy's house who has a pool, and it's like a mile away, and we're just like, to our parents are like, we're going to go to Jeremy's house, bye. And then maybe Jeremy's house.
Community.
Yeah, maybe from our friend Jeremy's house, we'll go to our friend Owen's house, and he lives like probably another mile away. And by the end of the day, we maybe left at like 9 o'clock, and we're back at 5, and then everyone comes over to our house to make dinner. And that's just how
I wanted to say, like, in the complex I live in, it's not even about some kind of fear of being, like, snatched up or anything. It's like they get weird about if any kids are out after dark or anything, or just, like, walking around, or if you skateboard or bike. It's a very restricted thing. And we even have, like, a little playground here, and kids over 8 years old are not allowed to use it just because of how strict it is. And it's like, it doesn't really make any sense to me how there's this strictness of this complex I live in. I don't know.
Do they give any reasons at all for having those restrictions?
I think it blatantly, like, it just annoys them. They just don't like it. Like, the board and stuff, they have meetings about it.
Up everyone, and it's gonna, because all teens are troublemakers, and that's how it is. So, you know,
Right.
we're gonna go there.
I like your hand motions.
Well, that's the other thing that's happened. We've really become a culture that is intolerant of young people, and it's partly, you know, we've become a very adult-centric culture. And one of the things that's changed since I was a kid is that when I was a kid, kids sort of dominated in a sense. There were more kids than there were adults. And this was sort of the baby boomer time. I was kind of at the leading edge of the baby boomer. And so there were kids everywhere. And you kind of had to make accommodations for kids. And generally, cultures always have made accommodations for kids. Kids are kids. But we have become a culture where we kind of want kids to become adults. So we do the things that actually prevent them from becoming adults, because the way kids become adults is through being independent, through getting out there.
I want to elaborate on that. Because I've never really, like, at least where I live, I've never experienced much like that. But it was interesting because one time, me and my friends, it was just us. We went to a local pizzeria, and the way the pizzeria works, it's not typical. You walk in and they give you, like, it's a thing. It looks like a credit card, and they have stations, and you go to each station, and you order what you want, and they swipe your card, and then when you leave the restaurant, they scan your card, and however much you spent, that's how much you pay when you leave. So we went up, we got our card, and we went up to order like you always do, and you just pay at the end when you leave the restaurant. You give them your card, and they were like, no, you have to pay right now. And I was like, why? That's not how it's ever worked in the past. And it's like made no sense to me. And then
I have a story too after you.
I was like, why? That doesn't make any sense. And they were like, oh, well, we've had kids stealing. And I was like, oh, they think we're going to steal from them.
Yeah, they're kind of the same. Like, we have a pool here too. And even when I was, like, younger, like, you know, I wasn't, like, wild in the pool or something. I would go in and they would just, like, come up to me over and over, like, make sure you don't splash, like, make sure you don't do this. And it would be this nonstop thing. Like, they just didn't trust me because of my age.
I think this is a topic that anyone who knows me knows I'm very, very, very passionate about. Something like, I think something that happens is, especially since, like, the invention of the internet, and just as media has kind of evolved and movies and TV are becoming more prevalent and things like that, just things are starting to become much more, like, media centered. I think something that has kind of happened is children are just kind of seen as like work and things that are supposed, like people are
Right.
forced, like, and there's the major assumption that children need to grow up as quickly as possible. And you see it in the schools, and like something that I've always personally believed is a big reason why the depression and suicide and anxiety rate is so high in youth nowadays is because you're literally forcing children to not be children anymore and to not do the
Right.
things children naturally do, such as playing or
Right.
sometimes acting out because they're still learning the
Right.
social conventions of our society.
Right.
And by forcing children to fit into like these little boxes of what they can and can't do, you're hurting them, because when they're old enough to make their own decisions, they're going to not know what the right decisions are to make,
Right.
because they've been,
Yeah.
everything's been decided for them their whole life, and now they're thrown
Right.
into a world where, oh, I'm like, I don't know how to spend money. I don't know what's good for me to eat. I don't know
Right.
where to live. I'm in a bunch of debt now. Like, there's no real preparation for a realistic world. And you have people who are 30 years old and don't know how to be an adult because they were literally never taught. And
Right.
I'm seriously worried about what my peers are
Right.
going to be like as adults, because there's the whole stigma around like millennials and how horrible they
Right.
are as adults. And I think when people get upset about that, like, you're the generations before millennials raised millennials. So there was an
Right.
issue in how you rate. People don't just turn out poor or whatever. Like, I'm not even going to comment on it because it's subjective, but people turn out how they're raised. Like, how you raise them is a direct result of how they are when they're adults. And like, when there's when you're so focused on making sure your child is a good adult when they're still a child, they're not going to be a good adult when they are an adult. And that people
Yeah.
seem to not realize how damaging it is to force someone to be something they're not.
Yeah, there's these expectations.
So like, I know my friend, I was like, it was when, it's what I was trying to say, when my friends and I, we biked over to a Wawa because we just wanted to. It was my cousin and my friend, and it was like a relatively like long bike ride. We just wanted to go there just for like the novelty of, we biked over to this Wawa and we're gonna sit in the woods and eat from the Wawa. But so we went in there, and I don't know, we spent around like, I don't know, 10, 11, because we had like a obviously we have a finite amount of money, but we had like a small amount of money to spend. We tried to like divide it up and try to make sure, like, okay, what are we gonna get here? And you know, who's going to get what and how much does that cost and all that, you know, stuff. And this woman is just like, you guys need to buy something. And we're like, well, that's what we're doing here. What do you, I mean,
Yeah.
and it's a wall.
Exactly. Like,
yeah, and then
what happens?
You're going to have to leave if you don't buy anything. And you can't be causing any trouble. It's like, I guarantee you, if we were adults, it wouldn't have happened. If we were younger, it wouldn't happen. But because we were teenage boys in that area, it's like, oh, we were in a group of 3. Oh no.
I think what happens is you force children into boxes, they rebel. The assumption becomes that all teenage boys, or like just teenagers in general, are horrible people who are just going to act out for no reason, because you've created a society where you've created a lot of people who do rebel. Like, there's so much, and when there's people like most of the people on this podcast right now who are all, like, other than Nathaniel over here, don't go to school, or like at least a traditional school, we are not going to do the same things as other children. So we are able to more easily recognize the stigma and like just how strange it is. Because obviously, if I went to a pizza place or whatever with 2 other people, I'm going to pay for my food and I'm going to eat it and I'm going to leave. But there probably is people who would go to a pizza place and try and steal pizza or whatever. But that's not, because that's just the nature of people. It's what you've created them to be.
You know, I think one thing that has happened, as I said before, is we've become much less tolerant of young people in many ways. I think it's always the case that part of growing up for some young people is doing things that are disruptive. But in the past, there was more tolerance of that. this was all right. This is something you'll grow out of. You know, it was not like it was taken as a serious crime, or this is a indication that this person is never going to be a decent human being. There was just kind of a general understanding. Yeah, sometimes kids get into trouble. Sometimes they create trouble. Sometimes they're noisy. Sometimes they don't pay for what they should be paying for. They're a little more likely to do that than adults are, probably, to be honest. But there was sort of some expectation, well, kids are kids, right? You know, that's, but we don't have that view anymore. And the result of that is young people are being deprived of the kinds of experiences that allow you to learn not to do those things, allow you to learn from consequences, allow you to learn from. So one of the research findings that I think is very telling here is that there's a clinical questionnaire called the internal-external locus of control scale. And what this assesses is the degree to which you feel that you're in charge of your own life versus the degree to which you feel that you're kind of a victim of other people's decisions, of people in power, of luck, of circumstance, and so on. So an internal locus of control, that means to the degree you have an internal locus of that control, to that degree you feel you're kind of in charge of your own life. You can make your own decisions, you can solve your own problems, and so on. You have an external locus of control, you feel like you're sort of a victim of fate. This questionnaire has been given to teenagers, normative groups of teenagers, ever since about 1960. And ever since this has been used, the internal locus of control has been going down. Increasingly, people are growing up feeling like they have no control over their own lives. No surprise, because if we in fact are controlling kids all the time, we're not allowing them to go out and play and explore away from adults. We're not allowing them to figure things out themselves. We're not allowing them to solve their own problems. How can they possibly develop an internal locus of control? I think that's one of the primary functions of play. Real play is always self-chosen, self-directed. It's not something that adults impose on children. It's not something where adults are solving the problems. That's where you learn to solve problems. When we're depriving children of all of that, then how are they going to develop an internal locus of control? And one thing we know from other clinical studies is people who don't have a strong internal locus of control are far more likely to become depressed or anxious at some point in their lives, clinically significantly so, than people who do have an internal locus of control.
And
so I think there's a cause-effect relationship here. You deprive children of freedom, and you therefore prevent them from developing a sense that they can control of their own lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the result of that is depression, anxiety, all these other things we're seeing in high numbers, even suicide. The suicide rate is much higher now among children and adolescents than it was decades ago.
I think it's fascinating.
Hey,
Dylan,
Yeah, I-
can Daniel say
yeah.
something?
hey, hold on. And sorry, going back to like video, I was thinking about, and like you, Peter, talking about how we don't really have self-control. Going back to video games, like in like survival video games, you have to make the decision whether or not, like, how am I going to get food? How am I going to get this resource? Like, how am I going to do these type of things? Then you have more control over that, and you control your own, like, if you're going to survive or not.
I know.
Oh, and on the subject of that, so like today I'm friends with this mom on Facebook, and like she has two preteen kids and she's a teacher, and she literally posted to all the millennials who want free education, healthcare, the military is hiring. And like I don't know, how do you approach a comment like that?
Well, if you want healthcare, just go and get shot, and then we'll heal your bullet wound, and So that's the. So don't worry about that. Just go across to another country, and yeah, the Army has other jobs. Oh yeah, the Army has other jobs. Can you just drive this Humvee, to this place, and then oh wait, those orders were wrong, you idiot. Even though you're not the person who did it, I don't care who gave you those orders. You're the person I'm going to blame. I'm mad at you. Now drive that Humvee all the way back. And you just get caught.
Other than that, you have no strong
Neil,
feelings
is that some
about it.
personal experience?
Yeah, Neil.
Personal experience, and I am extremely scarred. But I mean, talking about like the whole thing about what was I gonna say? Yeah, so talking about like how kids have almost like no control over their lives, and it's like the second you try to give like a little bit of free reign, it's not just the parents that are, you know, the ones who don't like it. Even if they are cooperative, like I know when Gina Riley was on here, she was saying that someone approached her, a neighbor knocked on their door, and her son was just getting answered, and had a multicolored t-shirt and said, which color is this one? Which color is this one? Which color is this one? It's like, oh my God, are you kidding me? And I think the saddest part about the worst part about the saddest thing about the study that, you know, you were talking about earlier with the 75 people was that the unschoolers named one thing, the most prevailing opinion of what was the worst thing that not the worst thing about being unschooler, the biggest downside. Right. And the biggest downside listed, this is adult unschoolers who some of them, their entire lives they've been unschooled. The number one thing was having to explain to people that don't understand it and can't comprehend. That.
I have one more thing, and then sadly I kind of have to go.
Okay.
Because my brothers are kind of getting anxious. But Peter, I was thinking, I always visualize this thing where it's like how crazy the idea of public school is. It's just the idea of, like, I envision it as being, of myself being put into like a small box, and then asking, you know, like who put me in the box was like, hey, this is kind of uncomfortable. Is there any way I can like get out of this? And then I'm saying like, stop rebelling. You're being crazy. Like, you're going to go to jail and you're going to kill yourself. Like, you're going to die and all this crazy stuff. And it's like,
that's how it is. Yep.
Crazy leap. And like people believe in it. Yeah. I just think it's a crazy way of doing something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, just to backtrack slightly, because I was trying to say about the like decision-making aspect of like being so, and then like not knowing what to do. Something that I've always thought is interesting, because it's an example that set up the way you'd think an example that was written out to be an example would be. I have two friends, one of which not allowed to have candy, like any candy. One of which is allowed to eat candy. Person who's allowed to eat candy eats this like unhealthy amount of candy. Person who isn't allowed to eat candy on Halloween literally makes himself sick because he eats all the candy. And I think that's a perfect analogy for what it's like. It's the same thing when you're a teenager and there's like, I don't know, like drugs or whatever. I have personally made the decision that I don't want to do any of that or partake in alcohol in my entire life, because that's my decision that I made. However, I have someone who's my exact same age who came from an extremely controlled life, who makes the opposite decision in that regard in almost every case.
One of the findings in both my study of the graduates of Sudbury Valley School and of the grown unschoolers is that when I asked them about college, in what ways were you disadvantaged? In what ways do you think you were advantaged in college? The primary advantage was that they saw themselves as being much more responsible in their behavior. They saw their roommates, they saw the kids from public school drinking every night, skipping classes, and so on and so forth, because these were people who hadn't grown up with the experience of taking charge of their own lives, making their own decisions, and knowing how to deal with the consequences of that. And so now they're off to college, away, not totally independent, because oftentimes their parents are on the cell phone with them every day, but nevertheless, there's no parent there directly there, no teacher there directly there telling them exactly what they have to do, and they haven't had experience with that before. So
so I think I gotta get going, but thank you so much, Peter, for coming on.
Thank
All
you.
right.
I've got to get going within 5 minutes also,
Okay.
at most.
All
So.
So,
All right, see
real
everyone.
quick, Nathaniel hasn't talked much throughout the whole
Oh,
thing,
yeah.
but he is a prime example of a lot of what we've been talking about because he has some mental health issues that he struggles with. Also, he goes to public school, so he's like a prime candidate. So here you go.
Yeah, so public school, pretty great. Not really. That is wrong. Nope. It sucks, especially
Yeah.
middle school, because I'm not going to say the name of this teacher, but we had a discussion on the phone policy at our school. We're not allowed to have them on in class, which is like understandable, but then we had a whole discussion about it, and like we were talking about rights and things, and this teacher literally told us that we had no rights whatsoever, and
What?
just was very disempowering
Wow.
of us. And if you look at most schools, they're literally brick boxes. With
I mean, the one thing you can
so
say
it
about
looks a
that
lot like
teacher
a
is
prison.
that he's honest, when he says you have no rights. But, he's telling the truth.
And real quick, I'm just going to say, Nathaniel is one of the smartest people I've ever met in my entire life. And I think if he was not restricted to a school, he would be one of, like, I'm not kidding you, one of my first interactions with him, I asked him if he wanted to do a podcast because, like, within 5 minutes of talking to him, I was like, wow, this person is, like, really, really intelligent.
Like, honestly, after this podcast, I'm really thinking about asking my parents if I don't go to high school and instead switch to like just being on my own, maybe like working with Martin and researching some things, like
Right.
just doing it on my own. Because like I want to go into like sound design and like lighting design, and they don't teach that in school. And
Right.
like so, and like theater, things like that. I have to do that sort of most of the time. I have to do that on my own. So I'm really thinking about after this podcast and like talking with my parents about it. And yeah.
Oh, good. I wish
So,
you
like-
well on that. Yeah.
Real quick question. So, like, how do I kind of deal with being friends with, like, that teacher who's a mom and, like, I'm friends with their kids?
Probably
it's-
just don't say anything. Yeah.
Like, yeah, how do you be comfortable with that when you, like, you're close with someone and then you find out their opinions are, like, very strong about something?
Yeah. Of course, it depends on who the person is, but
Yeah.
it's always, I find that if somebody really disagrees with me, rather than just come straight out with, I think you're wrong, and this is why, I start off looking for some kind of common ground. Like, now I don't know how this would work with you talking with this person, but if I'm talking with a parent who has a very different view than I do of child raising, my first question would be, and what are your goals for your child? What is your dream for your child? And then they might say, well, I want my child to be happy. I want them to be able to make a living. I want them to be a good person. I want them to be, and then I'll talk about, well, that would be my goal too, and then you can move to sort of how does one achieve those goals?
Exactly.
And then
Okay.
you talk about, and then you can talk about so try to get people to take a step back and think more distantly. Sometimes I'll even say to somebody, I'll oftentimes give this in a talk to parents, what is it that you would like to see written on your gravestone? Made it to Harvard or was a good person, right? Everybody would choose good person, right? And so then the question is, how does one become a good person? What does it even mean to be a good person? And if that's the goal, then why are we putting so much effort on getting high grades in school and all of that kind of stuff, which actually, to be honest, doesn't even really increase your chance to go to Harvard. You have as big a chance to go to Harvard from unschooling, maybe a bigger chance as if you get all A's in school. So but that's a side point. But the point of trying to shift the conversation to get the person to talk about, sort of their deeply held values. What is it? What are their dreams for their kids? And then go from there to put your point of view in that shared context of a shared understanding. I don't know if that would work in your case.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what she tells her kids about my lifestyle personally, or like
Right.
how they view me.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is sort of hard to be. We're creatures of norms. We're creatures. Everybody wants to be normal. Everybody seeks being normal. And when you're doing something different, or when you are different in some way, then it makes one uncomfortable. And
Yeah, it's a sad situation.
Yeah, and so I think
Especially
that
if normal is not necessarily what you perceive as morally right.
that's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the situation people are in.
Peter said he had to leave. Do you want to just normally do like a statement thing? So I guess you can go since you're already talking.
Yes, to go.
So all right. So I've enjoyed this very much.
It's been so much.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Great to meet you.
Yeah.
An honor to have you on because I've been a really big fan of your work.
Well, thank you.
Pretty much my entire time of like consciously being able to think about this sort of subject.
Well, thank you.
Like when I actually I freaked out when I got the message that you were going to be on the show. I was like running around my house. Very excited.
And for the hour and 30 minutes, I knew you existed and what you stood for. Like, as I told you, like now I'm really thinking about asking my parents if I can be unschooled. Like, just, so thank you so much for this, like,
well, thank
experience.
You. Thank you. Give your parents give your parents my book as a gift. See if they would read it. Free to learn. So
all right.
Okay. Have a great evening.
All right. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
You too.
Thank you.
Humanity has been on an epic journey of discovery, learning the truth about the world we live in. New discoveries about the true origins of humanity, ancient history, free energy, as well as the systematic corruption of world governments are now on the forefront of our daily reality. Is the world headed towards destruction based on control and power? Or is an opportunity now being presented to shift and uplift into a higher consciousness? My name is Mel V, co-founder and creative director of Conscious Consumer Network, an independent broadcast network that was launched on the 1st of January 2015. In the last 3 years, Conscious Consumer Network has broadcast over 2,800 shows in multiple languages, featuring guests from across the world, whilst creating media that is aimed at the creation of a free, fair, peaceful, just, sustainable world. Conscious Consumer Network provides full training and an interactive support network for all broadcasters, and we are always looking for inspiring and educational content.
Hi, this is Lady Liberty.
And this is Mira Siegel.
In 2018, Conscious Consumer Network has expanded to multiple broadcast locations, increasing our availability and reach across the world, remaining on the cutting edge of independent media. If we wish to create a better world, we must first create better media, geared towards real education instead of indoctrination. You guys really are what changing the world is going to be about. It's educating kids at a grassroots level. Having become a pillar of stability in the turbulent world of independent media, we have even more going on in 2018. Conscious Consumer Network is a publicly funded network, and we rely on all of you to keep us on the air. Show your support for independent media by donating to our 2018 Network Support Fund. Dare to seek a better world. Support independent media.